and therefore was of very little value. Fiction writing, especially in the book-length form of the novel, simply had not yet risen in American and British letters to a level of legitimacy that it was considered a worthwhile pursuit for readers. Now, Melville, with the assistance of his older brother Gansfort, did turn around and submit it to the prestigious London firm of John Murray, and it was accepted by Murray as an authentic narrative and published as part of Murray's home and colonial library. And on the strength of Murray's acceptance of the book, it was quickly accepted by the rival American firm, rival to Harper and Brothers, of Wiley and Putnam, and promptly published in the United States. It was an overnight sensation on account of its exotic subject matter and the appeal of that subject matter to Western audiences. One of the book's best known original readers was Henry David Thoreau, who read it during his sojourn at Walden Pond, and along with other travel narratives that Thoreau appears to have read in this period, likely contributed to Thoreau's own symbolic use of travel as a motif in his book, Walden, that he published in the next decade. It was likewise successful on account of Melville's mastery of English and his stylistic strengths. Ironically, those strengths exacerbated persistent distrust and controversy about the book's truthfulness in contemporary newspaper reviews, with critics insisting that there was no way a common sailor before the mast could have written this eloquently about anything, let alone the highly exotic and poetic subject matter that prevailed in his book about the South Seas. Now, these suspicions were justified in a lot of respects, as I'll address, but not in all respects. And if we're considering Typee's candidacy for something like GAN status, I think it helps to recognize the origins of the book in Melville's experience and his use of direct personal experience as an essential orienting factor of the story. Melville did take a voyage on a whale ship, the Acushnet, and in the Marquesas Islands, he did desert with Tobias Green, and both took refuge with the Typee tribespeople. Much of what he describes in the book, he saw with his own eyes and experienced personally. And these aspects of individual discovery and self-fashioning bring the book into alignment with a good number of other American literary works that we continue to read and celebrate for motifs such as their penetration and exploration of the unknown, whether external or internal regions of the unknown, for their practice of looking unconventionally at human affairs, and of examining Western civilization in the role of outsider, and their embrace of heterodox viewpoints that arise from that process. It is the author's claims to direct experience and authority that contributed heft and persuasiveness to these aspects of the book, and enabled at least a willing suspension of disbelief by most of its original readers. Melville's experience of achieving this was transformative to him personally. In the following decade, he confided to Nathaniel Hawthorne, "From my 25th year, I date my life," quote unquote. Explaining to Hawthorne that since that age, a 3-week period had scarcely passed in which he had not unfolded within himself. Now, when he wrote that to Hawthorne, Melville was actually lamenting the degree to which his name had become inseparable from his first published book. He complained that he would go down to posterity as the man who lived among the cannibals. And when he said that, he was far along into the composition of his sixth book and the work of his fame, Moby Dick. But the book he wrote at age 25, in the years 1844 and 45, was Typee. And so he appears to have been referencing his first serious efforts to convert personal experience into narrative. And its heterodox critique of Western society, especially his narrative role as thoughtful witness and outspoken opponent of European and US military expansion in the South Seas, as well as culturally destructive missionary activity, to which he devoted considerable space in the book. In the process, enraging some powerful interests and leading to its censored and expurgated state in the second American edition, released by Wiley and Putnam in 1849. But the intellectual and creative unfolding that Melville described to Hawthorne call attention to the book's combination of direct experience and imaginative expansion. In the book, he lengthened the 3 to 4 week period of his time among the Typees to 4 months, and he used other books to creatively expand upon his personal account. In the framing for this webinar, it was asked what books influenced the writing of Typee. And there are some familiar works we could point to. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, for instance, with which it was often compared by publishers and the press. We could also point to Western perspectives on primitivism, popularly associated with the writings of Rousseau. But the most consequential sources of influence on Typee were by authors most of us probably aren't familiar with. William Ellis's Polynesian Researches, Captain David Porter's Journal of a Cruise to the Pacific Ocean, Charles S. Stewart's Visit to the South Seas. Some of the most interesting examples of Melville's appropriations from these texts illustrate his practice of borrowing their content, but reversing their attitudes of Western supremacy toward the natives and ways of life they describe. In his account of marriage practices among the Typee, for instance, and this may be familiar to some of you from your reading of the book, Charles S. Stewart describes the marriage relationship as existing in what he calls the baneful form of a singular polygamy, a plurality of husbands instead of wives, a baneful form of singular polygamy. Now, after drawing from Stewart's information on courtship and three-way spousal relations and reflecting upon them with expansive, original observations on the contrast between Polynesian and civilized practices, Melville points out in Typee that in the absence of a court of chancery, as a result of this arrangement, separations are easy in the Typee Valley. And, quote, a baneful promiscuous intercourse of the sexes is hereby avoided, and virtue, without being clamorously invoked, is, as it were, unconsciously practiced. A wonderful example of Melville appropriating raw material, factually oriented raw material from a source in order to flesh out his own narrative, but assume an ideological interpretation of what he's describing that is exactly contrary to the attitudes of his source. And he tended to do this again and again in Typee, and we can see examples of it in the books he later wrote as well. So in Typee, he is establishing habits of composition and source appropriation that characterized his craft throughout the rest of his career. And so the campaign Melville waged overtly against Western imperialism and missionary activity in several chapters of the book was carried out by him covertly in his use of material by other writers, and very often in the form of selectively lifted passages from sources that he would use as prompts to his creativity and ideological propensities, contributing to his general practice in the book of what we could call descriptive reflective approaches to subject matter, first describing a scene, action, or event, whether such from his own experience or something he appropriated from the writings of an earlier visitor to the South Seas, describing it eloquently in detail, but then meditating on it in ways that often compare Western practices and assumptions unfavorably to what he calls the unconsciously virtuous ways of life prevailing among the Typee. He points out elsewhere in the book that the penalty of the fall lays very lightly on these people. And as my friend and colleague and our fellow scholar, Jonathan A. Cook, has explored in detail, Typee makes extensive use of the archetypal Western myth of paradise, the Garden of Eden, and the fall as a means of suggesting the lost innocence and depredatory character of civilization. Now, the consequences of these narrative practices were severe to Melville in both the short and the long term of his career, and they even made him notorious among his neighbors as late as 1859, when Melville was visited at his home in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, by an admirer, young Titus Munson Cohen from nearby Williams College. Cohen later reported that Melville was considered worse than a heathen by the good folks of Pittsfield, where he lived in Western Massachusetts. And the remark is very interesting as a kind of localized distillation of the religious umbrage that was provoked by Typee amongst many of its earliest readers, and that dogged Melville's career since its initial publication. And for this, by way of closure, I'll just turn to a passage from the contemporary reviews of Typee. As one reviewer of Typee had put it, seldom have savages found so zealous a vindicator of their morals. Rarely, too, has Christianity owned so ungrateful a son. So an ungrateful son of Christianity and civilization, and worse than a heathen in the eyes of Melville's neighbors in Pittsfield, revealing the extent to which Melville was thinking and describing things ahead of his time in a lot of respects with Typee, and the public image this book set for the remainder of his career, and which was in many ways confirmed later in Moby Dick, with its overtly blasphemous, in some respects, subject matter, and local Pittsfield condemnations that Moby Dick was more than blasphemous, quote unquote, in the eyes of 19th century readers. On that point, I'll conclude my talk and hand things over to Matt.
Thank you so much. Yes, Professor Rebhorn, if you would be so kind as to follow up.
Thank you, and thanks to Steve for sort of setting the table. What a great job of sort of outlining, contextualizing, historicizing the novel. But for my part of this, I really want to sort of think about the question that was sort of posed to us, but also posed sort of on the webinar itself, which is what makes Typee a great American novel. And I really want to sort of lean on that last term of the question novel and ask what choices that Melville made as a writer, writing a work of fiction, a novel. What did they do to sort of contribute to its greatness? Now, Steve has done a terrific job of sort of laying the groundwork that this wasn't a published as a novel per se, but I think as 21st century readers looking back at it, we understand it as a novel, and to understand it as a sort of great novel, I want to sort of spend some time thinking about it in sort of two ways. The first way the first question I really want to ask is, how did these sort of aesthetics of Typee that Melville develops, how are they sort of anticipatory? How do they sort of lead to, or how can we see them develop in arguably his greatest novel, Moby Dick? And then secondly, sort of divorced from Moby Dick, how might we think about sort of Typee as a great American novel, though I think maybe not the greatest American novel. So the first way to sort of think about this is to think about character, right? The character of the narrator in Typee is dubbed Tomo. And while we know that his name is actually Tom, we are likewise met with a sense of someone perhaps sort of trying on a different identity, of putting the reader on guard about the truth of the narrative we are about to read. And even the subtitle of the novel, A Peep at Polynesian Life, and this sort of follows in the 19th century tradition of offering a glance or a view, but a peep suggests a kind of voyeuristic pleasure, but also a kind of, for lack of a better term, sort of seductive occlusion of a full view, which again kind of clouds the authenticity and truth of the text. This isn't a history or a recounting. It isn't, like Porter or Ellis or Stewart that Steve mentioned, but something akin to a kind of titillating peep show that puts the reader on notice that he or she will need to read around and through and under the veil that is lifted. So when we think about Moby Dick, I think about that very first line, call me Ishmael, right? It introduces our protagonist, but at the same time, it raises the question of his sort of authentic identity. Is he really named Ishmael, or is this just a sort of nom de plume or a sobriquet that he uses to put the reader on guard about any notion of authenticity or truth? This holds true for the white whale himself. Moby Dick, after all, is not the name the whale chooses for himself, but is rather a name he assumes from the figures that hunt him. And the amplified versions of what the white whale is and what he represents, from Ahab's definition to the townhouse story to others, works to make the reader sort of self-conscious about his or her own reading practices. So I want you to think about this as sort of Melville amplifying and developing in Moby Dick what he kind of gestured to in Typee. So we might also think about this in terms of sort of narrative devices, right? And the most obvious narrative device in Typee is, of course, Tomo's leg, which swells and keeps him from fleeing the island. It functions as an important choice on Melville's part to keep his narrator from engaging in the roving that he is accustomed to and that he does for the sort of first quarter of the novel. But more than that, it stands as a kind of bodily index of his attraction to and repulsion from the worlds that he's kind of balancing between. With his fears of being eaten alive, the leg swells and acts like a symbolic barometer of his misgivings and lurking fears. It heals as his suspicions are allayed, but it flares up again when Tomo's desire to leave the island becomes sharper and more pronounced when he discovers, or so he thinks, evidence of the Typee's cannibalism. As a symbol and a literary device, it wonderfully records and reflects Tomo's two-mindedness about his stay on Nuku'hiva, and it speaks to Melville's sort of investment and embodiment in the body as a valid counterpoint to the mind, and as a record of his conflicted sentiment regarding the benefits and detriments of island life as well as Western life. Now, one might write a whole study on how Melville uses appendages, from Tomo's leg to Billy Budd's fist. But for now, I think we can see the lines of connection between Tomo's leg, which disables him, and Ahab's leg, which does the same. But in Moby Dick, Ahab's leg takes on a life of its own, not only speaking to Melville's continued investment in the body as a register of meaning, but also as a literary device, a rhetorical device, and a symbol of the death drive of Western civilization, the quest for truth in the face of the infinite, and also the sort of damaged, riven state of men in 19th century America. And again, we see that same sort of idea, that the idea that Melville sort of introduces in Typee begins to sort of develop and sort of become much more complicated as we reach maybe his sort of greatest work, Moby Dick. And finally, I want us to think about sort of the pairings that show up here. As some of you may know, Leslie Fiedler many years ago sort of noted that American fiction, particularly in the 19th century, is often structured by the sort of male pair, you know, Hawkeye and Uncas, or Huck and Jim. And I'm not saying that, you know, Tomo and Toby or Tomo and Corey necessarily fit in that same line, but it's worth noting that Melville uses the idea of this pairing to continue to develop his ideas of sort of comparative cultural studies, the things that Steve sort of mentioned at, previously, right? How is Toby, the assuredly Western figure, like and unlike Tomo, the figure who seems to bounce between the West and the South Pacific? How is Tomo like and unlike Corey, the figure who Aeneas-like carries Tomo around on his back? How are Toby and Corey like and unlike each other? Or for that matter, how might we read Toby, the avatar of the West, and his abandonment of Tomo as a counterexample to the islander Corey's sometimes obsessive devotion to Tomo? Again, speaking about the aesthetics of Melville's choices, the pairing functions as a productive way to raise questions about the relationship between characters, between cultures, and between worlds. Now, everything that Corey represents, and for that matter, that Marnu, the figure outside of the thrice mysterious taboo, comes to represent, is condensed, of course, in the figure of Queequeg, the South Seas harpooner in Moby Dick. Like Tomo's less than overwhelming relationship with Corey, Ishmael is equally dubious about his hotel room companion at the beginning, since, like Typee, Queequeg is also a cannibal. Yet rather than teeter between love and hate, sort of appreciation and suspicion, Ishmael comes to be sort of mated to Queequeg's cannibalistic character. They form a pair in line with the genealogy Fiedler outlines. In fact, he talks about them. In many ways, Melville develops the literary use of this pairing in Typee in even more defined ways in Moby Dick. This pairing allows Melville to continue his comparison of pagan and Christian cultures, but rather than simply use Queequeg to point out the problems in Western Christianity, which he does, he also moves beyond difference and explains the close kinship between these two figures and the heroism of Queequeg, a George Washington cannibalistically developed. So if Typee uses the pairing as a spur for inquiry, in Moby Dick, the pairing does this, and it allows the reader to reconceptualize the notion of heroism as decidedly hybrid, decidedly tattooed, decidedly pagan. After all, if in Typee, Tomo must fight off the nefariously devoted Corey at the end, in Moby Dick, it is the embrace of Queequeg's coffin that allows Ishmael to survive. So I've just sort of talked a little bit about Typee's sort of greatness in that, as I said, kind of anticipatory mode, the way it kind of seeds the ground for later works like Moby Dick and the sort of greatness of Moby Dick. But I want to kind of use the sort of back half of my sort of talk today to really think about what in particular makes Typee a kind of great American novel. And it is a kind of great American novel in its own right. Its greatness, and I'm going to sort of suggest this here, is not a matter of its cleanness or its well-wrought quality. Rather, its greatness stems from its radical skepticism towards all well-worn institutions: the West, Christianity, the mind, capitalism, and others, right? And yet, its attempt to believe, to survive, to prosper even, in this kind of deconstructed world and to find some pleasure in it. So to think about this, I want us to all accept the premise that this is a novel that knocks everyone down a few pegs, right? Western Christians become misguided, capitalist enterprise becomes exploitation, and so on. This is at the heart of Melville's radical skepticism. The seedy underside to everything is exposed. Christians become unchristian-like, even as untainted islanders become cannibal captors. As we encounter Melville's musing, such a sort of mainstay, as Steve mentioned, of sort of his later works, we learn to distrust everything we have been taught to believe. Yet what makes Typee so great is not just its investment in sort of disillusioning us or of critiquing each and every institution and idea we thought we knew. I mean, that's part of it. But its greatness lies in Melville's recounting how one figure navigates the world of partial truths and threadbare notions. There is value, Melville suggests, in adopting what Tomo calls in chapter 17 a, quote, elasticity of mind. To be skeptical, as he is following Montaigne, one of his influences here, is to free ourselves to think in new ways about everything we encounter. To treat experiences without sort of preconceived notions or generic blinkers, but with freshness and newness and openness. Is it any wonder that as soon as Tomo experiences this elasticity of mind, his leg likewise stops hurting? Unhindered by prejudice and sort of overcooked beliefs, Tomo is free to wander, both physically and intellectually. And part of what makes this novel so compelling is not the answers it provides, so much as the support it lends to asking questions and trying out new ways to encounter the world. A new identity not beholden to this or that outmoded idea. Finally, I want to tell you that what makes Typee great is not only its radical skepticism, but also its deeply subversive pleasures. As an exercise in liberating the reader's mind, this text is peerless. As an exercise in reorienting a reader's wandering, it is terrific. But as a text that matches this kind of potential unsettledness with unbridled pleasures, it does something extraordinary. This is a text, in other words, it's not only biting and critical, it's also very funny. To give one example from chapter 14, consider this. At first, Corey goes to work quite leisurely, but gradually quickens his pace and waxing warm in the employment drives the stick furiously along the smoking channel, applying his hands to and fro with amazing rapidity, the perspiration starting from every pore. As he approaches the climax of his efforts, he pants and gasps for breath, and his eyes almost start from their sockets with the violence of his exertions. This is the critical stage of the operation. All his previous labors are in vain if he cannot sustain the rapidity of the movement until the reluctant spark is produced. Suddenly he stops, becoming perfectly motionless. His hands still retain their hold of the smaller stick, which is pressed convulsively against the further end of the channel along the fine powder there accumulated, as if he had just pierced through and through some little viper that was wriggling and struggling to escape from his clutches. The next moment, a delicate wreath of smoke curls spiraling into the air. The heap of dusty particles glows with fire, and Corey, almost breathless, dismounts from his steed. I love this passage, right? It's funny, not only because it allows a narrator to sort of reflect on how hard Corey is working to make a fire, and then after this, how easily it is done with a match in the West. If this were all, it would sort of easily fit into Melville's comparative cultural analysis that allows him to reflect on the merits and issues with both cultures. But it's funny because this is also a thinly veiled, and if I'm being honest, not too thinly veiled, account of masturbation. Corey's labor rubbing the stick, his breathless dismounting, the wreath of smoke that emerges at the end of the staff at the climax, all of this is Melville's rather tongue-in-cheek description of a man masturbating. To be sure, Melville is trying to evade the pernicious eye of his puritanical audiences that sort of Steve mentioned before, the sort of made him have to publish a kind of expurgated version of this. And so he has to couch this kind of sexual event in these terms. But this is a bit of narrative that neither advances the plot nor really offers a scathing rebuke of Western or island culture. It is rather a young writer, wary of his interlocutors, having a laugh at their expense. This is about pleasure, the pleasures of reading that Melville was instilling in his reader. But it is a pleasure that comes from, that sort of turns on its subversiveness, its naughty quality, its peep, like a peep show. Amidst all of the high-minded critiques and scathing attacks, this interlude marks out a kind of different readerly experience. Not serious, not critical, but wickedly funny, and subversively so. And this is all to say that the greatness of Melville's novel isn't just about its blasting away at conventions, but it is also about its complex tone that can run from radical skepticism to unbridled pleasure. Think of a similar scene of pleasure that occurs in Moby Dick in The Squeeze of the Hand, a chapter that occurs just after the chapter where Pip is abandoned in the ocean and goes mad. And we get a sense of what Typee is inaugurating here. The pain of deeply skeptical metaphysics married to and sharing readerly space with the pleasures of subversive delight. This is a greatness that occurs with brio in sort of Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint, or more recently in Paul Beatty's The Sellout. Like Roth and Beatty and others, Melville's writing is utterly serious and at the same time does not take itself too seriously. Like Tomo balancing between cultures, between worlds, between sort of incompatible truths, Melville's Typee is itself a balancing act, teetering between skepticism and pleasure and keeping them both balanced from the first peep to the last. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much. Thank you both. Now, I am going to, here's my image again. I'm going to encourage everyone to put in questions as soon as possible in large numbers. I'm going to start actually with, well, maybe it's a basic question. How differently was it taken by the English audience and the American audience? So you said it was published first, or accepted first in London. Was it read differently? And I would say not just at the time, but have there been any continuing differences in readings, in England and America?
I guess I'll speak first on that. For the original unexpurgated publication, reviews were similarly sensational on the subjects of the book's engaging nature and the craft of its writing and the appeal of its subject matter, but also identical on moral reservation about much of the text. Both publishers received complaints from readers that the book had been published at all. It's only the American edition, however, that was censored and revised. The book did not get tinkered with outside of typical anglicizing forms of editing in that venue. In London, the result of this, because so much offensive material was cut from the American edition, beyond the first couple of years of publication, British and American readers were experiencing very different books. So much of what had offended the original readership had been removed from Wiley and Putnam as early as 1849, and that was the book that continued to get reprinted and published. So initial reaction, I think a lot of similarity in terms of both praise and reservation about the books. But for the majority of the 19th century, Americans were reading a version of the book that we don't recognize anymore. All contemporary editions of Typee, for instance, are based on the tend to be based on the British edition rather than the expurgated American version.
Actually, may I just interrupt then? When did the American version become the unexpurgated one?
The unexpurgated one?
Yeah, like 1900, 1930.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the edition edited by Melville's literary executor, Arthur Stedman, shortly after his death in the 1890s, was based on the British version, and subsequent American editions have followed that example.
And Professor Rebhorn, did you also want to speak to that question?
I think what's interesting is that Typee, Steve sort of mentioned that, there's sort of the things that happened in Typee kind of influenced the works that came after, and I sort of talked a little bit about how it influenced Moby Dick. But the text that comes immediately after Typee is Omu, which is a kind of I don't know what we want to call it, kind of retreading of Typee, sort of going back to, and also kind of exploring different aspects of sort of the South Pacific. And those two books, I think, really had a kind of fascinating, as sort of Steve was getting at, a kind of discrete sort of trajectory in the 19th century. But I think what's interesting is the way that they sort of come into literary theory. They sort of have a new life in literary theory when we start thinking about sort of colonialism and post-colonialism. And I think it's interesting, and I don't have this sort of facts and figures at my fingertips, but I would say the sort of revisiting of it through British and American audiences, and thinking a little bit about the kind of variations, and there's a text and a B text, and John Bryant's done a lot of work with it, but sort of in the sort of starting in the 1980s, sort of thinking about it as part of a kind of intervention, and thinking about British and American sort of colonial efforts and post-colonial efforts and things like that. So that's not quite the answer, I think, that Steve was talking about, sort of the way these two texts kind of jockeyed for position and then sort of came into being. But I think it's interesting to think about the kind of long afterlife of Typee and the way it kind of got new juice added, in some sense, in the 1980s, when people started thinking about it as a text that is highly critical of both British and American and any kind of imperial efforts. So that's what I would say.
I might add, David, that the expurgated version of Typee in America did little, if anything, to allay the severity and the ferocity of the condemnations of Melville that tended to emerge every time he published a book, owing to the sensation that surrounded the original publication. The original version remained very vivid in the minds of individuals in many quarters of the American critical establishment, and they never tired of reinvoking their basis for outrage in subsequent reviews, just as more favorable reviewers delivered the more backhanded compliment of continuing to associate Melville with the power and appeal of that book, even when Melville was trying to outgrow that original book and get beyond it and do something more meaningful.
And I might sort of add to what Steve is talking about. I mean, I think a lot of it is about the sort of choices that Melville makes, and I sort of, in that sort of scene I was talking about of a kind of veiled description of masturbation that sort of didn't make it to the cutting room floor in the sort of American version of it, even the expurgated version. I think Steve can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of the expurgated version was sort of, the ire was directed towards the sort of on the missionary work in particular, and sort of Melville's treatment of missionaries and sort of really kind of critique of missionary work. But I think one of the things we can see as a kind of a sort of sign or a testament to its greatness, and something I think we can sort of trace, through Melville's career, is the way that even under these pressures, and I would say even in the 1840s, when Melville's thinking about this, and in 46 when he publishes it, he understands that sort of being particularly vicious with missionary societies and missionary work is not going to win him any favors. And it's almost as if he's kind of operates at multiple levels within the text, right? So there's ways in which like it's almost a kind of easy target, and then he kind of bakes it into the sort of form and structure and sort of texture of the piece. All of these things that you really can't, I wouldn't say he sort of does it with a sort of a wink and a nod, but there's a way in which there's so much of the text that is skeptical but also subversive that even in that sort of expurgated version, it's still a pretty sensational text, and sensational for some of the ways I was talking about, sort of titillating and a little raunchy, and sort of engaging with these genres like the South Seas cannibal tale, but also kind of pushing back again. So all of that sort of kind of what sort of lies beneath, and really is a through line from the British to the American version and back again.
And that, if I can elaborate once again, David,
Sure.
please, that shows up in the reviews too.
Yeah.
Right and left, Melville was condemned, not so much for, well, outside of the obvious critiques of cultural, Western culture. He was condemned not for what he states straightforwardly, but for what he kind of craftily insinuates, indirectly and through suggestion, planting seeds of profane inclinations into the minds of his readers, so that the more vulnerable among his readers might be led astray by what is insinuated. Fayaway, for instance, pulling off her tapa robe to use as a sail when he claims to have been boating around with her in one of the lakes in Typee, never refers point blank to her nakedness, just refers to pulling that tapa robe away, and the charming posture and appearance that she wore for him in that period. And it should be pointed out too that the passage of kind of veiled onanism that Matthew has described. Not everybody agrees with that reading, and that really helps to illustrate the heavily suggestive character of Melville's means of writing. Great editor, the late Harrison Hayford, editor of the Northwestern Newberry writings of Herman Melville, rejected that reading. And I'll never forget a question he once asked me. He said, "I don't masturbate that way, do you?"
Oh dear.
Right.
Okay. I'm going to slightly shift the subject. I also, by the way, I just mentioned for a gleeful bawdry, I'll just mention to people James Branch Cabell's Jurgen, A Comedy of Justice, as continuing that tradition in the American letters. I'm actually going to go to Jonathan Cook's question and extend it a little bit. He's asking, can you comment on satire in Typee and its Swiftian devices? And I'm a mad historian. I'd like to extend that to, can you comment in particular about it in relationship to how satire was being practiced in America in the 1840s, the previous generation, in England, and what therefore what are in his mode of satire is of the era, what harks back to Swift, and general devices, and what is innovative in his development of satire, to any and all.
I would expect no less specialized a question from Jonathan Cook in the audience, which is more likely to send me to the books behind me in a frantic search than to speak off the top of my head. I can refer to some examples where satire seems embedded in his source use. I referred in my talk to a kind of diametrically opposite interpretation of the significance of the marriage vow, which was more combative than satirical. But one interesting example occurs when Melville is appropriating source material on religious practices and the gods, the idols, the statue idols that exist all around Typee, where Melville appropriates a source's account of how disrespectfully one of the natives reportedly treated the idols, and Melville makes subject matter out of this as well, and its power of interest lies, of course, in the sacrilegious nature of the period through a Western perspective, and how it just fails to conform with sacred subjects as they're described and treated in the West. But recalling the details from memory, I'm afraid I can't really do it satisfactorily, but he describes the idols as a kind of a besieged and besodden lot, fixed, staring straight forward as if afraid to look right or left at the expense of offending one of the natives who habitually reprimand and shout at them, as well as physically abuse them. And I think there are a number of ways in which he's comparing that process to less obvious varieties of Christian hypocrisy and sacrilege as they're practiced in institutionalized forms in a deeply materialistic and capitalistic society.
Yeah, I would actually say it's such a great question about the sort of the forms and the sort of scope of satire in Typee. And again, I'm trying to think of particularly American examples of this, and nothing's coming to mind at this moment, but I would say it does share with that sort of I'm thinking of something, like Gulliver's Travels or Tom Jones, sort of that sort of 18th century, early 19th century sort of really kind of pronounced satire, right? And I think we could sort of spend all afternoon pointing to how he's doing it with, as Steve talked about, with the idols, or as he's doing it with, the sort of that scene of masturbation, which I know Harrison disagrees with. Okay, fine, I'm willing to talk about that. But throughout the text, these sort of moments where and it is a very kind of episodic, and it has that episodic narrative, and it sort of has those chapters which kind of have, like Moby Dick, or even some later text, sort of moments where he's going to kind of talk about something, reflect on it, and usually in this very satirical vein. I think one of the things that is also a through line there, to something like Tom Jones, but all the way ahead to something like I said, like Paul Beatty's The Sellout, is the way structurally the novel kind of works against itself, if that makes sense. This is a narrative that sort of adopts a whole bunch of different genres, right? It sort of adopts the South Seas adventure tale. It kind of is like that ethnographic accounts. It's like a missionary tale. It's all these things that it's very much like. And I see it sort of deepest and most sort of pronounced satire in the way that it kind of flits from genre to genre and kind of kind of works to blow them up, right? And I think it's one of the real sort of pleasures of the text is watching how, this kind of romance text with, with Fayaway as the sort of, with the sort of pagan princess kind of unravels, or the way that his sort of like, it's like paradise, it's like paradise regained. Oh, except for he has that sort of very famous passage at the beginning where he sort of encounters, where he's on the way to Typee, he encounters the two children, and he's like, all the world was before. He's sort of riffing on Milton and sort of Paradise Lost. And then it's sort of like Paradise Regained, except it's really not a Paradise Regained, because we get to see all these kind of, other parts to it. So I would say that the much like a lot of kind of, I don't know, sort of Blackwood's articles, or sort of Poe in his sharpest way is sort of making fun of these individual ideas. But I think one of the things that really sets Typee apart is the way, as a kind of narrative that has a shape to it and has someone who's very familiar with writing, with inhabiting a genre. He also works kind of really sort of laboriously to kind of blow up all of these genres. And I don't necessarily think that that's satire in the same way that satirizing the idols is satire. It's almost like a kind of structural satire that I would argue to you he sort of picks up in Omu, and then he really kind of runs with in Moby Dick, which is also a kind of generically hybrid text that sort of touches on different forms and genres, but also works to kind of strip away some of the sort of the problems with it, or strips away some of the coverings that allow the problems to sort of emerge. So very much like a kind of a Gulliver's Travels, or Tom Jones, or something else like that.
I was going to say
Certainly,
Robinson Crusoe meets Tristram Shandy.
Tristram Shandy is the one I was thinking of, yeah.
And I was just going to add, in a very basic sense, to use subject matter that his readers considered exotic and outlandish, to use that subject matter in ways that critique his readers' own, culture and way of life, sounds very Swiftian to me. And again, perhaps contributed in an indirect way to Thoreau's use of similar satirical approaches in Walden, where it is his practice to describe his own neighbors in Concord as doing unconscious forms of voluntary and unconscious forms of penance. They're the savages. They're the ones who need to be visited by missionaries to experience redemption. Right,
brute neighbors and all that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would say though that one of the things that I think Melville does, and it's not one of the things we have to kind of cop to if we're going to talk about Typee, is his first novel, and it's really rough, and I don't mean that in a kind of put down, like, he hadn't quite figured things out, but there's a way in which, like, he is, you can kind of almost feel him kind of stretching these kind of literary muscles that he will sort of, develop and grow sort of later on. But I don't think we can sort of, I don't want to sort of make the claim, and I don't know if Steve would want to either, that this is somehow like a forgotten masterpiece. And in fact, I would say that part of what makes it so great is its kind of rough edges, right? The way that it kind of, there's a kind of pleasure there, I think, in reading it and in watching him knock things down, right? And in a way, you could argue that maybe something like that occurs in Moby Dick as well, right? Particularly, I would say, sort of in the first part of the book, before they get to see it, as a sort of similar idea before it kind of moves into that kind of very epic feel or mythic feel. But I think we can't, I don't want to make a claim beyond what the text sort of supports. And I think the text is wonderful for its, as I sort of talked about, kind of its non-smooth edges, right? The way that it's, the ending is whenever I teach the text, the ending's a kind of hot mess, right? It's sort of, Melville doesn't, my sense is, and we could talk about this, Melville doesn't quite know how to end the novel, right? And so he kind of, everything kind of accelerates at the end, and then he kind of, ties it up with a bow and sort of like on to the next. And I think we can't discount the fact that this is someone still sort of stretching his sort of, writerly muscles. But I admire it for its sort of full-throated, like maybe satire, but full-throated sort of skepticism, subversiveness about everything from West to the South Pacific to Rousseau or someone else, but also to the very form of the novel, form of a kind of narrative itself, which it kind of implodes at the end in a kind of wonderful way.
I agree. We can't forget that it's Melville's first book, and in some respects, journey work. Especially if we want to compare it and contrast it with the work of his fame, like Moby Dick.
Thank you. I'm going to go to another question from the audience, from Daniel, actually the second of two. We may get back to the first one. What was Melville's reaction to the literary criticism of his book?
Well, he waged a personal campaign against the accusations of fraud and falsehood that very often showed up in the press, and that motivated his publishers to pressure him to produce forms of evidence and documentation that could be put forth and used to further establish the credibility of his narrative. We know that he wrote at least one letter for publication in a newspaper that he intended to serve as a rejoinder to many of the criticisms against the authenticity of the book. Never got published, at least to our knowledge. If it did, it hasn't been discovered yet. And since many 19th century newspapers are fragmentary, it could well be lost. But he refers to it in other letters, and we know he sought the assistance of journalistic friends in the effort to get that rejoinder published. And in many respects, a lot of biographers argue that he remained embittered throughout his life about the charges of immorality that were waged against him in the original reviews, and responded with considerable indignation to those charges when they continue to pop up in successive reviews of other books, sometimes by the very same writers. As I indicated, there were newspaper critics out there who waited for Melville to publish a new book so that they could go on record condemning it. But of course, generally speaking, Melville's response of all this was to defy it and go on writing works like Moby Dick, like Pierre, like The Confidence Man, like the anonymously published short stories of the 1850s that take such a subversive approach to contemporary moral pieties and notions of respectability. So I think that's the most cutting response I could make, is that from the very beginning, from those covert battles that he waged with many of the attitudes and the sources that he used for Typee, that sense of conflict he had with the establishment of his time extended throughout his career.
And if I could just jump in there, I think that's pretty well said. And I would say, yeah, it would have been great if Melville had sort of written and we could find that letter. I mean, he does, kind of confide sometimes to Hawthorne or to his publisher about, this or that sort of reading of the text, or more sort of his his literary position or something else like that. But my response to that would be, the proof is kind of in the pudding. He finishes up Typee and, undeterred, writes Omu, right? And within a year or so of Typee, right? And it goes back to the same material. And Omu, I think, gets kind of short shrift when we think about sort of Typee and Omu as sort of these two kind of joined novels of the South Seas. But Omu is a kind of, is a much, for my money, much bleaker and dark, sort of darker and even more sort of, I don't know, bitter, what we'd call it, but sort of, it's definitely sharper, I think, than Typee. That has a trial, it has them going to prison, it has a sort of mutiny, it has sort of wandering in these South Seas, in like Tahiti, and the landscape is completely sort of destroyed by Western, introduction of cattle to the South Pacific and things like that. It's sort of completely decimated the world. Or my favorite in Omu is sort of, the reason they have mosquitoes in Omu is because some American captain got really pissy about not being able to do something, and so he kind of cracked open a barrel, and now this island has mosquitoes. I mean, it's so, to Typee's sort of gleeful subversiveness, I think we think about Omu, he revisits the same idea and he kind of turns up the pressure. I mean, if it was simmering before in Typee, it's really boiling by the time we get to Omu. And and I think Steve would agree with me that by the time we get to like Marty, which is his third novel, which again kind of sort of touches on the South Seas, although I find it even to this day a puzzling text to sort of wrap my head around. We get a lot of, again, same kind of thing, same sort of technique, same sort of, and he's amplifying this technique as he's kind of pushing through. So, I mean, I don't know what we lack in kind of direct sort of confessional language from Melville. I think we see abundantly clear in his choices of what to do next, and more importantly, like how to do it, right? The things he's talked about in Typee that were pretty sensational, he kind of revisits and kind of ups the ante some in Omu, and I think in a different way, and maybe towards a different end in Marty.
Yeah, of Omu, Melville's friend Ebert Dykink famously said that Melville brought a sailor's grudge to the defenders of the missions. That was really well put.
Thank you. I have a question. Oh, the Swift reminds me. How about the whole utopian tradition? And I know this is somewhat overdetermined and possibly older to you than it will be to me, but yet how does Typee fit in consciously to the utopian tradition, which I would say not just, there's an island somewhere off there where there are pagans who have perhaps constructed a good world, but the complexity of, is it in point of fact a good model, that you're supposed to think it through, from Thomas More onwards, is this in point of fact the way we should or live or not? So how much, as I say, aside from being an island and so forth, how much is it in this whole utopian tradition? And what does contribute to that utopian tradition?
Well, I think that brings into relief the ambivalence that Matt had associated with so much of the text. So, Matt, I'm happy to let you elaborate on points you made in your talk.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a text that, whenever I whenever I teach it or sort of think about it, I always sort of, kind of midway through the novel, I always ask the question that is sort of always comes to the forefront of my mind, which is, this is an island that is sort of uncorrupted by, particularly sort of capitalist exchange, right? Sort of, he famously talks about it. They lack money. The sexual mores that sort of define the West, and in particular, is sort of puritanical America, are kind of absent here. You don't really have to work for food. I mean, it is a land of plenty. He has, there's all the sex a young man could want with whomever he wants as the narrator. He has his own personal servant. And the question I always come to is, why would you ever want to leave, right? And this is, in some ways, Melville does such a sort of tremendous job of talking about this, and David, the way you were talking about sort of an island off there that's so different from and free of the problems and the issues that attend Western culture that Melville is sort of aware. I mean, after all, we have to remember that the novel begins with him jumping ship, right? He's jumping ship because the West, as it's sort of embodied on the ship, is terrible, right? It's drudgery, it's awful, it's repetitive, and they're sort of in these doldrums, and so unable to sort of move forward. And so he sort of leaves that, and he finds himself in this sort of utopian, and I think probably thinking about someone like Thomas More is right, but like it's this world that is full of there's no money, there's lots of food, there's lots of companionship, lots of sex. I mean, there's nothing. And the question is, why doesn't he leave? And it kind of turns on that moment where they're like, we want you to be part of this, right? We want you to be part of this utopian community, but the kind of the price you have to pay is you have to be tattooed, and you have to be tattooed in the face, right? And the sort of vaguely comic scene of his avoiding being tattooed, and Karki, the tattoo artist, sort of chasing him around and being like, we can do it really just really fast or whatever. But it's that for him, this utopia is slightly different than a kind of Morean utopia, right? Because for him, the utopian is being unmarked, right? It's being able to move between these utopian culture and back. So I think it's an interesting question, because Melville does a terrific job of basically making you like, why would you ever want to leave? And it's like the minute, the tattooing starts and they want to claim ownership of him and sort of invest him in the culture itself fully, right? He's not an outsider or a sort of interloper or a sort of betwixt and between figure, but once he has to be in there, suddenly he's like, I think they're cannibals. I think, I always laugh to myself because, Marnu basically is like, what is the line? He's like, mother. And suddenly Tomo's like, I miss my mom and I have to get out of here, right? It's like mom and apple pie. And suddenly he's like, I don't want to be part of this utopian culture after all. And so it's this, I think again, we can kind of attribute it to Melville, sort of a young writer, he does such a good job of describing this and satirizing the West that you sort of ask yourself why you wouldn't want to be here. But for him, utopia isn't a place. It is a kind of posture almost, right? A sort of an ability, a sort of a kind of liminality that he really, really loves. And that's why I think we haven't talked about Marnu, and maybe we won't, but Marnu's the sort of figure who comes in, who can kind of move between cultures, if you remember the novel. And Melville's like totally smitten with him, right? And I think we can also read a little envious of his ability to kind of move wherever he wants and do whatever he wants. So I would say that sort of utopia is a place, of course, and he's drawing on, More or, even maybe, Shakespeare's Tempest or something else like that. But he's also sort of, saying, for lack, it's going to sound really corny when I say it, but like it's a state of mind, right? Utopia is like the ability to not be tied to place, no matter how spectacular and utopian it is.
In fact, utopia is no place. Once he realizes
Exactly.
that Typee is a place, it's no longer utopia.
Right. And as soon as they want to draw him in and kind of literally kind of, the Typee sort of tattooing isn't, even at some point, right, Tomo's like, oh, you can tattoo my arm if you want. And they're like, no. Like, in Typee culture, you have to be tattooed in the face. And he realizes, and sort of with a kind of electric clarity, that he said it would make me hideous in Western culture. And I think in some sense, you can think about that tattooing, that moment, that's what drives the narrative right to its close, right? And suddenly all the sort of utopian, and I mean that kind of big utopian sort of ideals start to crumble, right? It's like they haven't been cannibals for, I don't know, 100 pages. And then suddenly, right after that, he's like, I want to go home. And then suddenly he's like, yeah, I told you they were cannibals. And he sort of discovers that they're cannibals. And then the novel kind of snowballs to its very end where he sort of escapes. So I don't know if that's quite the answer, to the question, but it does make me think about, why would you ever want to leave a sort of utopian space?
Let me just add to those good points on the subject of cannibalism. Of course, in that regard, they want him to be part of them to the ultimate degree, right? Because he professes to be afraid of being eaten. And the cannibalism and the persistent effort to tattoo him are two of a number of elements that add tension and suspense to the narrative, right? That in a very good old-fashioned way make it a great story to read. And we should probably consider the extent to which such devices in some ways kind of worked at cross purposes with things Melville did elsewhere in the narrative, such as his critique of Western civilization and his description of the Typee Valley in paradisaical terms. Again, kind of obliging us to ask, all right, to what extent are we seeing greatness here, and to what extent are we seeing journey work and maybe unresolved narrative plans that a more seasoned and mature Melville may have had a little more control over. But I think it also goes back to the point that Matt made at the outset, and that is that no way of life escapes the narrative unscathed, uninterrogated, non-undermined in some way. And we should emphasize that the Typees and their way of life is just as vulnerable to that critique in the end of Typee. And it reminds me, once again, of a chapter of Moby Dick, chapter 23, after both Ishmael and the short-lived character within Melville's conceptions, Bulkington, have both kicked the dust off of their feet and are heading out to the wide ocean. In that chapter, The Lee Shore, when he dismisses Bulkington, Ishmael points out that Bulkington kind of emblematizes a mortally intolerable truth, and that is that we are drawn towards journeying and the search for truth, not because we're guaranteed to arrive at that destination. Not that truth is guaranteed to us. The only reason we do it is to maintain what he calls the open independence of our sea, right? Free-mindedness, avoiding being socialized and conditioned and conventionalized according to some kind of external system. And again, to invoke Thoreau's example, why did Thoreau leave Walden after describing the wonders of his life there in contrast to civilization? It got too familiar and old. He was ready to move on to something else and continue that journey into the unknown. And that might also be a useful way of attempting to resolve that question in Typee, that utopia ultimately isn't a place, it's a state of mind that we maintain by keeping our minds open and unfettered to externally received opinions and traditions.
Right, and I would say, sort of to follow up with that, I mean, the figure who probably represents that with the most sort of most clarity is, of course, Ishmael, right? Sort of figure who is a kind of rover by nature, but is, has that freedom of mind that I think, if you like Moby Dick, you find his musings to be particularly rewarding. If you don't, you find them particularly annoying. But he's someone who, physically is here, there, and everywhere. He sort of, kind of replays that scene in Typee of like, oh my God, I don't like, Queequeg's going to eat me, and then suddenly he's joined with Queequeg, and it's a kind of wonderful. But that sort of openness, that the way that Ishmael's sort of utopia is his buoyancy, right? His ability to kind of bob along, as opposed to Ahab's sort of iron will and sort of magnetic draw. We can see sort of shades of that in Tomo too, right? Sort of the figure who wants to be able to kind of continue his wanderings and continue his musings, and to sort of not worry about like the young boys not afraid of a dinner, not concerned about their dinner, as I'm sort of murdering Emerson right here, but sort of this idea of the nonchalant. He wants to be sort of a figure who kind of moves between and betwixt, and I think for him that is utopia itself. It's not a place on a map. It's a sort of place inside.
Thank you. I'm going to go from there to Daniel's other question, his first question, which I'm going to gleefully twist again in a historic direction. With respect to the discussion on pleasure in the novel, to what extent is it helpful to think about this aspect of the novel as quote unquote queer? This is an abstract question. I want it to be historicized. If I can, you can still answer his question, but to what extent is the way he talks about sex, common in for his time period? How much is he stretching? And I'm going to say, if we look back to, say, Dangerous Liaison, forward to Whitman, it's not as if it's impossible to talk about sex. Is there a sort of an everyday Straussianism, everyday esoteric writing, which he's partaking in? Or is this, in point of fact, stretching where the literature is for his time and place?
Well, I don't see much of an explicit nature in Typee, to go back to Matt's points about the communication by indirection and suggestiveness. And of course, that's a versive quality that many of the more astute reviewers, such as they were among Melville's contemporary, that they really took into account for. So again, Melville's skill in providing a kind of Rorschach test for readers is on display in Typee, and he would go on to perfect that approach in later books. To the speaker's question, there certainly is a lot of homoerotic elements to be identified in his descriptions of such figures as Marnu and Mahivai, and to some extent Kori. Fayaway is, of course, the female subject of attraction and appeal that he puts out front there, but plenty of critics have delved deeply into his description of the magnificent appearance of the male warriors in the Typee tribe as the beginnings of certain homoerotic elements of Melville's fiction that it extends, of course, all the way up to Billy Budd at the end of his life.
My response to Daniel's question would be, I think, not to be sort of play the professor, but I think it depends on what we mean when we say the word queer, right? And I think I do think of the text as a queer text, but I think about it in a sort of a multitude of different ways. I think about it as a queer text in the way that Steve was just talking about. It is a text that sort of gives voice to a kind of the pleasures of sort of desire, same-sex desire, pleasures, and I think in a very sort of post 19th century way of a kind of, it does give voice to and sort of communicates the pleasures of same-sex attraction. I think we could read Tomo and Toby as having that. I mean, they do sort of form this sort of a marriage on board the ship, and I think his relationship with Marnu, with Kori sort of suggest that. But I would sort of think about it more as the kind of polymorphous, and sort of, he says this is a story about someone who seems the sort of the pleasures, the sexual pleasures here are not delimited to just Fayaway, although she has is a kind of spectacular example, and I love, Steve, the example you read. It's always one of my favorite ones to do. He's sort of, again, kind of suggestive without being explicit. But there's a way in which, right, this is very much amongst other things that Tomo is exploring. I would say he is exploring, different aspects of his sort of identity or his predilections or sort of what he imagines his place in the world. And one of those things, one of those avenues for doing that is through sort of desire and through sex. And I think that's a Typee, we don't want to sort of think about that away from that idea. And I can only imagine that might have been exactly one of the things that the American sort of version drew its ire the most, right? That sort of way in which he sort of engaging this and representing it for us. On a different side, and a kind of less specialized or less particular way, I think it is a text that is a queer text in the sense that it queers a lot of the ideas, the notions, the histories, the preconceived notions, not only about sexuality, but about sort of manifest destiny, about sort of the right of, the rightness of something like capitalist exchange, of the idea of them being of the South Pacific Islanders being cannibals, and being sort of less than their the sort of white imperialists. And in that sense, I do think that part of its the pleasure of the text we could think of as a kind of queer pleasure, but not in that, not bounded in some sense by exclusively to the notion of sexuality, but to its sort of kind of wide-ranging queering of all these different ideas and things like that. And I know it's a little bit of a dodge, but I think in some sense, if we're thinking about sort of sort of queer criticism from the 90s or whatever, I think that falls in line with that sort of reading of that as a text that whose queerness is not only explicitly about sort of desire, but also about a kind of readerly or sort of aesthetic desire to queer ideas of what a novel does or what it can't do or things like that. And I think if you're looking for someone, a fellow New Yorker to think about as a kind of doing this 211, it's Whitman, right? So Whitman does the same thing with poetic form in a lot of ways that I think Melville does with sort of narrative form, maybe not entirely in Typee, but we can see it sort of as it progresses.
Thank you. We're getting near to the witching hour, so I am actually going to ask, if I may, for final thoughts, a concluding 30 seconds, 60 seconds from each of you, and then I'll do a last little bit myself. To reverse the alphabetical order, Professor Rebhorn, may I ask you to go first, then Professor Olsen-Smith?
So I really appreciated the chance to sort of think with you guys about about this text that I find really compelling and great, if we're going to use great. And I want to make sure that the line that we've drawn between, it's great because of the ways it draws on Milton or Swift or, Defoe or whoever, and the way that it anticipates, Moby Dick or Billy Budd. I think those are all really important. But I do think we need to maybe sort of carve some space to think about this as a text that is considerably more aesthetically and ideologically complicated than I think maybe even we sort of, we've thought about for the last bit of time since our talk started. I would want us to make sure that we think about this text not only because it's a sort of journeyman piece, and I would sort of, I could agree with Steve on that, but that it really is doing some really wonderful, funny, sort of biting, and really kind of innovative things in its own right. And I think as a text, I don't want to, sort of use too much about the sort of anxiety of the anxiety of influence and think about, it's only a good text because of the way it has all these lines going to other texts around it. But I think in some ways, it's really the birth of this really original voice in American letters. And it does some really astonishing things. And I wish we had all the time in the world to kind of, mark out some of the ways that I think it really does this. But I think my takeaway for us would be like, let's make sure that we think about it as kind of in its own, on its own merits, a kind of great American novel.
Thank you. And Professor Olsen-Smith.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks again to Matt, David, and NAS, and everyone in attendance. I enjoyed this talk very much. Journeyman aspects of the book. Yeah, I wouldn't be comfortable, slotting it as Journeyman's work in its entirety. And going back to an earlier point that Matt made. Comparing Melville to Whitman, that is wonderfully apt. Their lifespans occurred almost exactly simultaneously, both born in 1819, both died in the 1890s, 91 and 92. No indication that they ever met, and very little indication that they were even aware of one another. We've got a review by Whitman of Melville, years prior to Leaves of Grass, before Whitman had hit the scene. And we know from a letter that dates to Melville's late life, correspondence letter to Melville, in which he alludes to what Melville had apparently described as his great respect for Whitman. Dispositionally, they couldn't be more different in a lot of ways. Melville retreating from his experience with authorship, but Whitman, remaining so gregarious and out there all of his life. Poetry fundamentally different from Melville's, and in form and perspective in a lot of ways. But Melville's great admiration for Whitman, someone so different from himself, really illustrates aspects of Typee that I think we should take away with us. Again, it's open-ended tendencies towards interpreting experience. It's conviction for freedom of thought and willingness to look at life and humanity outside of the box, mainly, like Moby Dick, as a book for our times. Melville makes a cosmopolitan of himself in Typee, a global citizen, and in our increasingly globalized age today, in which populations from all over the globe continue to intersperse in degrees of affinity and complexity that the world has rarely seen before. Melville's writing as a whole and that cosmopolitan perspective remains very relevant to many of the the challenges and experiences we face in our own age.
Thank you. So I have some concluding business, but I'll just say first, thank you very much. Thank you to our participants. Thank you to our audience. We do this for you. We can't do it without you. Your questions make this, lively for the entire Q&A. So thank you everyone who you can see, and thank you everyone whom you can't see. I am going to advertise a little bit. First off, if you enjoyed this, perhaps you might consider becoming a member of the National Association of Scholars. It's easy. Go to our webpage. I think we've got multiple buttons. So we welcome new members, and you can see our ideals. You can see the sort of work we do. Speaking of the sort of work we do, let me advertise what's coming up next. In this series, I believe what comes up next is on Tuesday, November 8th, The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. Then November 15th, The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. And then even further, but I think the one after that's going to be November 22nd, The Virginian by Owen Wister. It's going to be fun. We also have a series on American innovation. Our next one on that is going to be November 17th on The Birth of Flight, history. So that's what's upcoming. I want to say again, if you have more questions, please send them to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I'd be delighted to forward your questions to our participants. And also, if you want to see this again, within 24 hours, National Association of Scholars YouTube channel, this will be up. You will be able to see it forever. So I think that's all of the final business. Again, thank you all so very much.